Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 6, Side 1. On the last day before Lent, Savonarola read Mass in the open square before San Marco's, administered the sacrament to a great multitude, and publicly prayed, O Lord, if my deeds be not sincere, if my words be not inspired by Thee, strike me dead on this instant. That afternoon his followers staged a second burning of the vanities. Alexander informed the Signory that unless it could dissuade Savonarola from further preaching, he would lay an interdict upon the city. Though now thoroughly hostile to the prior, the Signory refused to silence him, preferring to let the onus of such a prohibition remain with the Pope. Besides, the eloquent friar might be useful in combating a pope who was organizing the Papal States into a power too strong for the comfort of its neighbors. Savonarola continued to preach, but only in the church of his monastery. The Florentine ambassador reported that feeling against the friar was so intense in Rome that no Florentine was safe there, and he feared that if the Pope issued the threatened interdict, all Florentine merchants in Rome would be thrown into jail. The Signory yielded and ordered Savonarola to quit preaching, this on March 17th. He obeyed, but predicted great calamities for Florence. Fra Domenico filled the convent pulpit in his stead, and served as the voice of his prior. Meanwhile, Savonarola wrote to the sovereigns of France, Spain, Germany, and Hungary, begging them to call a general council for the reform of the Church. The moment of vengeance has arrived. The Lord commands me to reveal new secrets, and make manifest to the world the peril by which the bark of St. Peter is threatened, owing to your long neglect. The Church is all teeming with abomination, from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. Yet not only do ye apply no remedy, but ye do homage to the cause of the woes by which she is polluted. Wherefore the Lord is greatly angered, and hath long left the Church without a shepherd. For I hereby testify that this Alexander is no pope, nor can be held as one, inasmuch as, leaving aside the mortal sin of simony, by which he hath purchased the papal chair, and daily selleth the benefices of the Church to the highest bidder, and likewise putting aside his other manifest vices, I declare that he is no Christian, and believes in no God. If, he added, the kings will call a council, he will appear before it and give proof of all these charges. One of these letters was intercepted by a Milanese agent and was sent to Alexander. On March 25, 1498, a Franciscan friar, preaching in the church of Santa Croce, turned the drama of the case upon himself by challenging Savonarola to an ordeal of fire. He stigmatized the Dominican as a heretic and false prophet, and offered to walk through fire if Savonarola would do the same. He expected, he said, that both of them would be burned, but hoped by his sacrifice to free Florence from the disorders that had been caused by a proud Dominican's disobedience of the Pope. Savonarola rejected the challenge. Domenico accepted it. The hostile Signory seized the chance to discredit a prior who in its view had become a troublesome demagogue. It approved of the resort to medieval methods and arranged that on April 7th, Fra Giuliano Rondinelli of the Franciscans and Fra Domenico da Pescia should enter a fire in the Piazza della Signoria. On the appointed day, the great square was filled with a crowd eager to enjoy a miracle or the sight of human suffering. Every window and roof overlooking the scene was occupied with spectators. In the center of the square, athwart a passage 2 feet wide, twin pyres had been erected of wood mixed with pitch, oil, resin, and gunpowder, guaranteed to make a searing flame. The Franciscan friars took their stand in the Loggia dei Lanzi. The Dominicans marched in from the opposite direction. Fra Domenico carried a consecrated host, Savonarola a crucifix. The Franciscans complained that Fra Domenico's red cape might have been charmed into incombustibility by the prior. They insisted on his discarding it. He protested. The crowd urged him to yield. He did. The Franciscans asked him to remove other garments which they thought might have been charmed. Domenico consented, went into the palace of the Signory, and changed clothes with another friar. The Franciscans urged that he should be forbidden to approach Savonarola, lest he be re-enchanted. Domenico submitted to being surrounded by Franciscans. They objected to his carrying either a crucifix or a consecrated host into the fire. He surrendered the crucifix but kept the host, and a long theological discussion ensued between Savonarola and the Franciscans as to whether Christ would be burned along with the appearances of bread. Meanwhile, the Franciscan champion remained in the palace, begging the Signory to save him by any ruse. The priors allowed the discussions to go on till darkness fell, and then announced that the ordeal could no longer take place. The crowd, cheated of blood, attacked the palace but was repulsed. Some arrabbiati tried to seize Savonarola, but his guard protected him. The Dominicans returned to San Marco, jeered by the populace, though apparently the Franciscans had been the chief cause of delay. Many complained that Savonarola, after claiming that he was inspired by God and that God would protect him, had allowed Domenico to represent him in the ordeal instead of facing it himself. These thoughts spread through the city, and almost overnight the priors following faded away. On the morrow, Palm Sunday, a mob of arrabbiati and others marched to attack the monastery of San Marco. On the way they killed some Piagnoni, including Francesco Valori. His wife, drawn to a window by his cries, was shot through with an arrow. His house was pillaged and burned. One of his grandchildren was smothered to death. The bell of San Marco tolled to call the Piagnoni to the rescue, but they did not come. The friars prepared to defend themselves with swords and clubs. Savonarola in vain bade them lay down their arms, and himself stood unarmed at the altar, awaiting death. The friars fought valiantly. Fra Enrico wielded his sword with secular delight, accompanying each blow with a lusty cry, Salvum fac populum tuum, Domine. Save thy people, Lord. But the hostile crowd was too numerous for the friars. Savonarola finally prevailed upon them to lay down their arms, and when an order came from the signory for his arrest and that of Domenico, the two surrendered and were led through a mob that jeered, struck, kicked, and spat upon them, to cells in the Palazzo Vecchio. On the following day, Fra Silvestro was added to the prisoners. The signory sent to Pope Alexander an account of the ordeal and arrest, begged his absolution for the violence committed on an ecclesiastic, and asked his authorization to subject the prisoners to trial and, if necessary, to torture. The Pope urged that the three friars should be sent to Rome to be tried before an ecclesiastical court. The signory refused, and the Pope had to be content with having two papal delegates share in examining the accused. The signory was resolved that Savonarola should die. As long as he lived, his party would live. Only his death, they thought, could heal the strife of factions that had so divided the city and its government that alliance with Florence had become worthless to any foreign power, and Florence lay open to internal conspiracy or external attack. Following the custom established by the Inquisition, the examiners put the three friars to torture on various occasions between April 9th and May 22nd. Silvestro succumbed at once and answered so readily as the examiners wished that his confession was too facile to be useful. Domenico resisted to the last. Tortured to the verge of death, he continued to avow that Savonarola was a saint without guile or sin. Savonarola, high-strung and exhausted, soon collapsed under torture and gave whatever replies were suggested to him. Recovering, he retracted the confession. Tortured again, he yielded again. After 3 ordeals, his spirit broke, and he signed a confused confession that he had no divine inspiration, that he had been guilty of pride and ambition, that he had urged foreign and secular powers to call a general council of the Church, and that he had plotted for the deposition of the Pope. On charges of schism and heresy, of revealing confessional secrets as pretended visions and prophecies, of causing faction and disorder in the state, the 3 friars were condemned to death by the united sentence of state and church. Alexander graciously sent them absolution. On May 23, 1498, the parricide republic executed its founder and his comrades. Unfrocked and barefoot, they were led to the same Piazza della Signoria where twice they had burned the vanities. As then, and as for the trial by ordeal, a great crowd gathered for the sight, but now the government supplied it with food and drink. A priest asked Savonarola, "In what spirit do you bear this martyrdom?" He answered, "The Lord has suffered much for me." He kissed the crucifix that he carried and did not speak again. The friars walked bravely to their doom, Domenico almost joyfully, singing a Te Deum in gratitude for a martyr's death. The 3 men were hanged from a gibbet, and boys were allowed to stone them as they choked. A great fire was lighted under them and burned them to ashes. The ashes were thrown into the Arno lest they be worshipped as the relics of saints. Some Piagnoni, braving incrimination, knelt in the square and wept and prayed. Every year until 1703, on the morning after the 23rd of May, flowers were strewn on the spot where the hot blood of the friars fell. Today, a plaque in the pavement marks the site of the most famous crime in Florentine history. Savonarola was the Middle Ages, surviving into the Renaissance, and the Renaissance destroyed him. He saw the moral decay of Italy under the influence of wealth and a declining religious belief, and he stood bravely, fanatically, vainly against the sensual and skeptical spirit of the times. He inherited the moral fervor and mental simplicity of medieval saints, and seemed out of place and key in a world that was singing the praises of rediscovered pagan Greece. He failed through his intellectual limitations and a forgivable but irritating egotism. He exaggerated his illumination and his capacity, and naively underestimated the task of opposing at once the power of the papacy and the instincts of men. He was understandably shocked by Alexander's morals, but intemperate in his denunciations and intransigent in his policy. He was a Protestant before Luther only in the sense of calling for a reform of the Church. He shared none of Luther's theological dissents. But his memory became a force in the Protestant mind. Luther called him a saint. His influence on literature was slight, for literature was in the hands of skeptics and realists like Machiavelli and Guicciardini. But his influence on art was immense. Fra Bartolomeo signed his portrait of the friar, Portrait of Girolamo of Ferrara, prophet sent by God. Botticelli turned from paganism to piety under Savonarola's preaching. Michelangelo heard the friar frequently and read his sermons devotedly. It was the spirit of Savonarola that moved the brush over the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and traced behind the altar the terrible Last Judgment. The grandeur of Savonarola lay in his effort to achieve a moral revolution, to make men honest, good, and just. We know that this is the most difficult of all revolutions, and we cannot wonder that Savonarola failed where Christ succeeded with so pitiful a minority of men. But we know, too, that such a revolution is the only one that would mark a real advance in human affairs, and that beside it the bloody overturns of history are transient and ineffectual spectacles, changing anything but man. 4. The Republic and the Medici, 1498 to 1534. The chaos that had almost nullified government in the later years of Savonarola's ascendancy was not mitigated by his death. The brief term of 2 months allowed to each seigneury and gonfalonier made for a hectic discontinuity in the executive branch, and inclined the priors to irresponsibility and corruption. In 1502 the council, dominated by a triumphant oligarchy of rich men, sought to overcome part of this difficulty by electing the gonfalonier for life, so that, while still subject to seigneury and council, he might face the popes and the secular rulers of Italy on terms of equal tenure. The first man to receive this honor was Pietro Soderini, a millionaire friendly to the people, an honest patriot, whose powers of mind and will were not so eminent as to threaten Florence with dictatorship. He enlisted Machiavelli among his advisers, governed prudently and economically, and used his private fortune to resume that patronage of art which had been interrupted under Savonarola. With his support, Machiavelli replaced the mercenary troops of Florence with a citizen militia, which finally, in 1508, forced Pisa to yield again to a Florentine protectorate. But in 1512 the foreign policy of the Republic brought on the disaster that Alexander VI had foretold. Through all the efforts of the Holy League of Venice, Milan, Naples, and Rome to rid Italy of its French invaders, Florence had persisted in its alliance with France. When victory crowned the League, it turned in revenge upon Florence and sent its troops to replace the Republican oligarchy with a Medicean dictatorship. Florence resisted, and Machiavelli labored strenuously to organize its defense. Its outpost, Prato, was taken and sacked, and Machiavelli's militia turned and fled from the trained mercenaries of the League. Soderini resigned to avoid further bloodshed. Giuliano de' Medici, son of Lorenzo, having contributed 10,000 ducats, or $250,000, to the League treasury, entered Florence under the protection of Spanish, German, and Italian arms. His brother, Cardinal Giovanni, soon joined him. The Savonarolan constitution was abolished, and the Medician ascendancy was restored. This in 1512. Giuliano and Giovanni behaved with moderation, and the public, surfeited with excitement, readily accepted the change. When Giovanni became Leo X in 1513, Giuliano, having proved too gentle to be a successful ruler, yielded the government of Florence to his nephew Lorenzo. This ambitious youth died after 6 years of reckless rule. Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, son of the Giuliano who had been slain in the Pazzi conspiracy, now gave Florence an excellent administration. And after he became Clement VII in 1521, he ruled the city from the papal chair. Florence took advantage of his misfortunes to expel his representatives in 1527, and for 4 years it again enjoyed the trials of liberty. But Clement tempered defeat with diplomacy, and used the troops of Charles V to avenge his ousted relatives. An army of Spanish and German troops marched upon Florence in 1529 and repeated the story of 1512. Resistance was heroic but vain, and Alessandro de' Medici began in 1531 a regime of oppression, brutality, and lechery unprecedented in the annals of the family. 3 centuries would pass before Florence would know freedom again. 5. Art under the Revolution. An age of political excitement is usually a stimulant to literature, and we shall study later 2 writers of the first rank, Machiavelli and Guicciardini, who belonged to this period. But a state always verging on bankruptcy and engaged in almost permanent revolution does not favor art, and least of all architecture. Some rich men, skilled in floating on a flood, still gave hostages to fortune by building palaces. So Giovanni Francesco and Aristotele da Sangallo, working on plans by Raphael, raised a palatial mansion for the Pandolfini family. In 1520-24, Michelangelo designed for Cardinal Giulio de' Medici a nuova sagrestia, or new sacristy, for the Church of San Lorenzo, a simple quadrangle and modest dome, known to all the world as the home of Michelangelo's finest sculptures, the tombs of the Medici. Among the Titan's rivals was the sculptor Pietro Torrigiano, who worked with him in Lorenzo's garden of statuary and broke his nose to win an argument. Lorenzo was so incensed by this violence that Torrigiano took refuge in Rome. He became a soldier in Caesar Borgia's service, fought bravely in several battles, found his way to England, and designed there one of the masterpieces of English art, the tomb of Henry VII in Westminster Abbey, this in 1519. Wandering restlessly to Spain, he carved a handsome Madonna and Child for the Duke of Arcos. But the Duke underpaid him. The sculptor smashed the statue to bits. The vengeful aristocrat denounced him to the Inquisition as a heretic. Torrigiano was sentenced to severe punishment, but cheated his foes by starving himself to death. Florence had never had so many great artists at one time as in 1492, but many of them fled from her turbulence and lent their renown to other scenes. Leonardo went to Milan, Michelangelo to Bologna, Andrea Sansovino to Lisbon. Sansovino took his cognomen from Monte San Savino, and made it so famous that the world forgot his real name, Andrea di Domenico Contucci. Born the son of a poor laborer, he developed a passion for drawing and for modeling in clay. A kindly Florentine sent him to the studio of Antonio del Paliuoli. Maturing rapidly, he built for the Church of Santo Spirito a chapel of the Sacrament, with statues and reliefs so vigorous and excellent, said Vasari, that they are without a flaw. And before it he placed a bronze grille that halts the breath with its beauty. King John II of Portugal begged Lorenzo to send the young artist to him. Andrea went and labored 9 years there in sculpture and architecture. Lonesome for Italy, he returned to Florence in 1500, but soon passed to Genoa and finally to Rome. In Santa Maria del Popolo he built 2 marble tombs, for Cardinals Sforza and Basso della Rovere, which won him high acclaim in a city then, in 1505 to 1507, buzzing with geniuses. Leo X sent him to Loreto, and there, from 1523 to 1528, Andrea adorned the Church of Santa Maria with a series of reliefs from the life of the Virgin, so beautiful that the angel in the Annunciation seemed to Vasari not marble but celestial. Soon afterward, Andrea retired to a farm near his native Monte San Savino, lived energetically as a peasant, and died in 1529, aged 68. Meanwhile, the Della Robia family had faithfully and skillfully carried on the work of Luca in glazed clay. Andrea della Robia exceeded in longevity even the 85 years of his uncle, and had time to train 3 sons in the art, Giovanni, Luca, and Girolamo. Andrea's terracottas have a brilliance of tone and a tenderness of sentiment that snare the eye and still the feet of the museum traveler. A room in the Bargello is rich with him, and the Hospital of the Innocents is distinguished by his decorative lunette of the Annunciation. Giovanni della Robia rivaled his father Andrea's excellence, as one may see in the Bargello and the Louvre. The della Robias almost confined themselves to religious subjects through 3 generations. They were among the most fervent supporters of Savonarola, and 2 of Andrea's sons joined the Brethren of San Marco to seek salvation with the friar. The painters felt Savonarola's influence most deeply. Lorenzo di Credi learned his art from Verrocchio, imitated the style of his fellow student Leonardo, and took the tenderness of his religious pictures from the piety nurtured in him by Savonarola's eloquence and fate. He spent half his life painting Madonnas. We find them almost everywhere, in Rome, Florence, Turin, Avignon, Cleveland. The face is poor, the robes magnificent. Perhaps the best is the Annunciation in the Uffizi. At the age of 72, feeling it time to take on the savor of sanctity, Lorenzo went to live with the monks of Santa Maria Nuova, and there, 6 years later, he died. Piero di Cosimo took his cognomen from his teacher Cosimo Rosselli, for he who instructs ability and promotes well-being is as truly a father as the one who begets. Cosimo came to the conclusion that his pupil surpassed him. Summoned by Sixtus IV to decorate the Sistine Chapel, he took Piero with him, and Piero painted there the destruction of Pharaoh's troops in the Red Sea, with a gloomy landscape of water, rocks, and cloudy sky. He has left us two magnificent portraits, both in The Hague, of Giuliano da Sangallo and Francesco da Sangallo. Piero was all artist, caring little for society or friendship, loving nature and solitude, absorbed in the pictures and scenes that he painted. He died unconfessed and alone, having transmitted his art to two pupils who followed his example by surpassing their master, Fra Bartolomeo and Andrea del Sarto. Baccio della Porta took his last name from the gate of San Piero, where he lived. When he became a friar, he received the name Fra Bartolomeo, Brother Bartholomew. Having studied with Cosimo Rosselli and Piero di Cosimo, he opened a studio with Mariotto Albertinelli, painted many pictures in collaboration with him, and remained bound to him in a fine friendship till parted by death. He was a modest youth, eager for instruction and receptive to every influence. For a time he sought to catch the subtle shading of Leonardo. When Raphael came to Florence, Baccio studied perspective with him and better blending of colors. Later he visited Raphael in Rome and painted with him a noble head of St. Peter. Finally he fell in love with the majestic style of Michelangelo, but he lacked the terrible intensity of that angry giant, and when Bartolomeo attempted the monumental, he lost in the enlargement of his simple ideas the charm of his qualities, the rich depth and soft shading of his colors, the stately symmetry of his composition, the piety and sentiment of his themes. He was deeply stirred by the sermons of Savonarola. He brought to the burning of the vanities all his paintings of the nude. When the enemies of the friar attacked the convent of San Marco in 1498, he joined in its defense. In the course of the melee, he vowed to become a monk if he survived. He kept his pledge, and in 1500 he entered the Dominican monastery at Prato. For 5 years he refused to paint, giving himself up to religious exercises. Transferred to San Marco, he consented to add his masterpieces in blue, red, and black to the rosy frescoes of Fra Angelico. There, in the refectory, he painted a Madonna and Child and a Last Judgment. In the cloisters, a St. Sebastian, and in Savonarola's cell, a powerful portrait of the friar in the guise of St. Peter Martyr. The St. Sebastian was the only nude that he painted after becoming a monk. Originally it was placed in the church of San Marco, but it was so handsome that some women confessed to having been stirred to wicked thoughts by it, and the prior sold it to a Florentine who sent it to the King of France. Fra Bartolomeo continued to paint until 1517, when disease so paralyzed his hands that he could no longer hold the brush. He died in that year at the age of 45. His only rival for supremacy among the Italian painters of this period was another disciple of Piero di Cosimo. Andrea Domenico Daniolo di Francesco Vannucci is known to us as Andrea del Sarto because his father was a tailor. Like most Renaissance artists, he developed quickly, beginning his apprenticeship at 7. Piero marveled at the lad's skill in design, and noted with warm approval how Andrea, when a holy day closed the studio, spent his time drawing the figures in the famous cartoons made by Leonardo and Michelangelo for the Hall of the 500 in the Palazzo Vecchio. When Piero became in old age too eccentric a master, Andrea and his fellow student Franciabigio set up their own bottega and for some time worked together. Andrea seems to have begun his independent career by painting, in the court of the Annunziata Church in 1509, 5 scenes from the life of San Filippo Benizzi, a Florentine noble who had founded the Order of the Servites for the special worship of Mary. These frescoes, though sorely injured by time and exposure, are so remarkable for draftsmanship, composition, vividness of narrative, and the soft merging of warm and harmonious colors, that this atrium is now one of the goals of art pilgrims in Florence. For one of the female figures, Andrea used as model the woman who in the course of these paintings became his wife, Lucrezia del Fede, a sensuously beautiful shrew whose dark face and raven hair haunted the artist to all but his dying days. In 1515, Andrea and Franciabigio undertook a series of frescoes in the cloisters of the Scalzo fraternity. They chose as subject the life of St. John the Baptist. But it was surely Andrea's hand that in several figures displayed one of his specialties, picturing the female breast in all the perfection of its texture and form. In 1518 he accepted the invitation of Francis I to come to France. There he painted the figure of Charity that hangs in the Louvre. But his wife, left behind in Florence, begged him to come back. The king granted permission on Andrea's pledge to return, and entrusted him with a considerable sum to buy works of art for him in Italy. Andrea, in Florence, spent the royal funds in building himself a house, and never went back to France. Facing bankruptcy, nevertheless, he resumed his painting and produced for the cloisters of the Annunziata a masterpiece which, said Vasari, in design, grace, excellence of coloring, vivacity, and relief, proved him far superior to all his predecessors, who included Leonardo and Raphael. This Madonna del Sacco, absurdly so called because Mary and Joseph are shown leaning against a sack, is now damaged and faded, and no longer conveys the full splendor of its color, but its perfect composition, soft tones, and quiet presentation of a family, with Joseph, suddenly literate, reading a book, make it one of the great pictures of the Renaissance. In the refectory of the Salvi Monastery, Andrea challenged Leonardo with the Last Supper of 1526, choosing the same moment and theme, "One of you shall betray me." Bolder than Leonardo, Andrea finished the face of his Christ. Even he, however, fell far short of the spiritual depth and understanding gentleness that we associate with Jesus. But the apostles are strikingly individualized, the action is vivid, the colors are rich and soft and full, and the picture, as seen from the entrance of the refectory, conveys almost irresistibly the illusion of a living scene. The Virgin Mother remained the favorite subject of Andrea, as of most artists of Renaissance Italy. He painted her again and again in studies of the Holy Family, as in the Borghese Gallery in Rome or the Metropolitan Museum in New York. He pictured her, in one of the treasures of the Uffizi Gallery, as Madonna delle Arpie, Madonna of the Harpies, so named from the avenging fates presented on the pedestal. This is the fairest of the Lucrezia Virgins, and the child is the finest in Italian art. Across the Arno in the Pitti Gallery, the Assumption of the Virgin shows apostles and holy women looking up in amazement and adoration as cherubim raise the praying Madonna, again Lucrezia, to heaven. So in Andrea's colorful illumination, the moving epos of the Virgin is complete. There is seldom any sublimity in Andrea del Sarto, no majesty of Michelangelo, nor the unfathomable nuances of Leonardo, nor the finished perfection of Raphael, nor yet the range or power of the great Venetians. Yet he alone of the Florentines rivals the Venetians in color and Correggio in grace. His mastery of tones, in their depth and modulation and transparency, might well be preferred to the lavishment of color in Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese. We miss variety in Andrea. His paintings move within too small a circle of subject and sentiment. His 100 Madonnas are always the same young Italian mother, modest and lovely, and at last cloyingly sweet. But no one has surpassed him in composition, few in anatomy, modeling, and design. "There is a little fellow in Florence," said Michelangelo to Raphael, "who will bring sweat to your brow if ever he is engaged in great works." Andrea himself never lived to reach full maturity. The victorious Germans, capturing Florence in 1530, infected it with plague, and Andrea was one of its victims. His wife, who had aroused in him all the heartaches of jealousy that beauty brings to marriage, shunned his room in those last fevered days, and the artist who had given her an almost deathless life died with no one by his side at the age of 44. About 1570, Jacopo da Empoli went to the court of the Annunziata to copy Del Sarto's Nativity. An old lady who had come to Mass stopped beside him and pointed to a figure in the foreground of the painting. "It is I," she said. Lucrezia had outlived herself by 40 years. The few artists whom we have here commemorated must be viewed not as a record, but as representatives of the plastic and graphic genius of this period. There were other sculptors and painters of the time who still lead a ghostly existence in the museums: Benedetto da Rovezzano, Franciabigio, Rodolfo Ghirlandaio, and hundreds more. There were half-secluded artists, monastic and secular, who still practiced the intimate art of illuminating manuscripts, like Fra Eustachio and Antonio di Girolamo. There were calligraphers whose handwriting might excuse Federigo of Urbino for regretting the invention of print. There were mosaicists who despised painting as the perishable pride of a day. Woodcarvers like Baccio d'Agnolo, whose carved chairs, tables, chests, and beds were the glory of Florentine homes. And nameless other workers in the minor arts. Florence was so rich in art that she could bear the depredations of invaders, pontiffs, and millionaires from Charles VIII to our own times, and still retain so much of delicate workmanship that no man has ever compassed all the treasures deposited in that one city by the 2 centuries of the Renaissance. Or by 1 century. For just as the great age of Florence in art had begun with Cosimo's return from exile in 1434, so it ended with Andrea del Sarto's death in 1530. Civil strife, Savonarola's Puritan regime, siege and defeat and plague had destroyed the joyful spirit of Lorenzo's day, had broken the frail lyre of art. But the great chords had been struck, and their music echoed throughout the peninsula. Others came to Florentine artists from other Italian cities, even from France, Spain, Hungary, Germany, and Turkey. To Florence flocked 1,000 artists to learn her lore and form their styles: Piero della Francesca, Perugino, Raphael. From Florence 100 artists took the gospel of art to 100 Italian cities and to foreign lands. In those 100 cities, the spirit and taste of the age, the generosity of wealth, the heritage of technique worked together with the Florentine stimulus. Presently all Italy, from the Alps to Calabria, was painting, carving, building, composing, singing, in a creative frenzy that seemed to know in the fever of its haste that soon the wealth would vanish in war, and the pride of Italy would be humbled under an alien tyranny, and the prison doors of dogma would close again upon the marvelous, exuberant mind of Renaissance man. Book 3, Italian Pageant, 1378 to 1534. Chapter 6, Milan. 1. Background. We do injustice to the Renaissance when we concentrate our study on Florence, Venice, and Rome. For a decade it was more brilliant in Milan, under Ludovico and Leonardo, than in Florence. Its liberation and exaltation of woman found their best embodiment in Isabella d'Este at Mantua. It glorified Parma with Correggio, Perugia with Perugino, Orvieto with Signorelli. Its literature reached an apex with Ariosto at Ferrara, and its cultivation of manners at Urbino in the days of Castiglione. It gave name to a ceramic art at Faenza, and to the Palladian architectural style at Vicenza. It revived Siena with Pinturicchio and Sassetta and Sodoma, and made Naples a home and symbol of joyous living and idyllic poetry. We must pass leisurely through the incomparable peninsula from Piedmont to Sicily, and let the varied voices of the cities merge in the polyphonic chorus of the Renaissance. The economic life of the Italian states in the 15th century was as diverse as their climate, dialects, and costumes. The north, that is above Florence, could have severe winters, sometimes freezing the Po from end to end. Yet the coastal region around Genoa, sheltered by the Ligurian Alps, enjoyed mild weather in almost every month. Venice could shroud its palaces and towers and liquid streets in clouds and mist. Rome was sunny but miasmic. Naples was a climatic paradise. Everywhere, at one time or another, the cities and their countryside suffered those earthquakes, floods, droughts, tornadoes, famines, plagues, and wars that a Malthusian nature sedulously provides to compensate for the reproductive ecstasies of mankind. In the towns, the old handicrafts supplied the poor with a living and the rich with superfluities. Only the textile industry had reached the factory and capitalist stage. One silk mill at Bologna contracted with the city authorities to do the work of 4,000 spinning women. Petty tradesmen, merchants of import and export, teachers, lawyers, physicians, administrators, politicians made up a complex middle class. A wealthy and worldly clergy added their color and grace to the courts and the streets. And monks and friars, somber or jovial, wandered about seeking alms or romance. The aristocracy of landowners and financiers lived for the most part within city walls, occasionally in rural villas. At the top, a banker, condottiere, marquis, duke, doge, or king, with his wife or mistress, presided over a court hampered with luxuries and gilded with art. In the countryside, the peasant tilled his modest acres or some lord's domain, and lived in a poverty so traditional that it seldom entered his thoughts. Slavery existed on a minor scale, chiefly in domestic service among the rich, occasionally as a supplement and corrective to free labor on large estates, especially in Sicily, but here and there even in northern Italy. From the 14th century onward, the slave trade grew. Venetian and Genoese merchants imported them from the Balkans, southern Russia, and Islam. Male or female Moorish slaves were considered a shining ornament of Italian courts. In 1488, Pope Innocent VIII received 100 Moorish slaves as a present from Ferdinand the Catholic, and distributed them as gratuities among his cardinals and other friends. In 1501, after the capture of Capua, many Capuan women were sold as slaves in Rome. But these stray facts illustrate the morals rather than the economy of the Renaissance. Slavery rarely played a significant role in the production or transport of goods. Transport was chiefly on muleback or by cart, or by river, canal, or sea. The well-to-do traveled on horseback or in horse-drawn carriages. Speed was moderate but exciting. It took 2 days and a good spine to ride from Perugia to Urbino, 64 miles. A boat might take 14 days from Barcelona to Genoa. Inns were numerous, noisy, dirty, and uncomfortable. One at Padua could house 200 guests and stable 200 horses. Roads were rough and perilous. The main streets of the cities were paved with flagstones, but only exceptionally lighted at night. Good water was brought in from the mountains, rarely to individual homes, usually to public fountains artistically designed, by whose cooling flow simple women and idle men gathered and distributed the news of the day. The city-states that divided the peninsula were ruled in some cases, Florence, Siena, Venice, by mercantile oligarchies, more often by despots of diverse degree, who had superseded republican or communal institutions vitiated by class exploitation and political violence. Out of the competition of strong men, one emerged, almost always of humble birth, who subdued and destroyed or hired the rest, made himself absolute ruler, and in some cases transmitted his power to his heir. So the Visconti or Sforzas ruled in Milan, the Scaligeri in Verona, the Carraresi in Padua, the Gonzagas in Mantua, the Estensi in Ferrara. Such men enjoyed a precarious popularity because they laid a lid upon faction and made life and property safe within their whim and the city's walls. The lower classes accepted them as a last refuge from the dictatorship of ducats. The surrounding peasantry reconciled itself to them because the commune had given it neither protection, nor justice, nor freedom. The despots were cruel because they were insecure. With no tradition of legitimacy to support them, subject at any moment to assassination or revolt, they surrounded themselves with guards, ate and drank in fear of poison, and hoped for a natural death. In their earlier decades, they governed by craft, corruption, and quiet murder, and practiced all the arts of Machiavelli before he was born. After 1450, they felt more secure through sanctification by time, and contented themselves with pacific means in domestic government. They suppressed criticism and dissent, and maintained a horde of spies. They lived luxuriously and affected an impressive pomp. Nevertheless, they earned the tolerance and respect, even in Ferrara and Urbino, the devotion of their subjects, by improving administration, executing impartial justice where their own interests were not involved, helping the people in famine and other emergencies, relieving unemployment with public works, building churches and monasteries, beautifying their cities with art, and supporting scholars, poets, and artists who might polish their diplomacy, brighten their aura, and perpetuate their name. They waged frequent but usually petty war, seeking the mirage of security through the advancement of their frontiers, and having an expansive appetite for taxable terrain. They did not send their own people to war, for then they would have had to arm them, which might be suicidal. Instead, they hired mercenaries, and paid them with the proceeds of conquests, ransoms, confiscations, and pillage. Dashing adventurers came down over the Alps, often with bands of hungry soldiers in their train, and sold their services as condottieri to the highest bidder, changing sides with the fluctuations of the fee. A tailor from Essex, known in England as Sir John Hawkwood and in Italy as Acuto, fought with strategic subtlety and tactical skill against and for Florence, amassed several 100,000 florins, died as a gentleman farmer in 1394, and was buried with honors and art in Santa Maria del Fiore. The despot financed education as well as war, built schools and libraries, supported academies and universities. Every town in Italy had a school, usually provided by the church. Every major city had a university. Under the schooling of humanists, universities, and courts, public taste and manners improved. Every second Italian became a judge of art. Every important center had its own artists and its own architectural style. The joy of life spread, for the educated classes, from one end of Italy to the other. Manners were relatively refined, and yet instincts were unprecedentedly free. Never since the days of Augustus had genius found such an audience, such stimulating competition, and such liberty. 2. Piedmont and Liguria. In northwestern Italy and what is now southeastern France lay the Principality of Savoy-Piedmont, whose ruling house was, till 1945, the oldest royal family in Europe. Founded by Count Humbert I as a dependency of the Holy Roman Empire, the proud little state expanded to a moment of glory under the Green Count Amadeus VI from 1343 to 1383, who annexed Geneva, Lausanne, Aosta, and Turin, which he made his capital. No other ruler of his time enjoyed so fair a reputation for wisdom, justice, and generosity. The Emperor Sigismund raised the counts to dukes in 1416, but the first duke, Amadeus VIII, lost his head when he accepted nomination as Antipope Felix V in 1439. A century later, Savoy was conquered by Francis I for France, this in 1536. Savoy and Piedmont became a battleground between France and Italy. Apollo surrendered them to Mars. They remained in the backwater of the Italian torrent and never felt the full flow of the Renaissance. In the rich Turin gallery and in his native Vercelli are the pleasant but mediocre paintings of Defendente Ferrari. South of Piedmont, Liguria embraces all the glory of the Italian Riviera. On the east, the Riviera di Levante, or coast of the rising sun. On the west, the Riviera di Ponente, or coast of the setting. And at their junction, Genoa, almost as resplendent as Naples on a throne of hills and a spreading pedestal of blue sea. To Petrarch it had seemed a city of kings, the very temple of prosperity, the gate of joy. But that was before the Genoese debacle at Chioggia in 1378. While Venice recovered rapidly through the orderly and devoted cooperation of all classes in restoring commerce and solvency, Genoa continued its tradition of civil strife between noble and noble, nobles and commoners. Oligarchic oppression provoked a minor revolution in 1383. The butchers, armed with the persuasive cutlery of their trade, led a crowd to the palace of the Doge and compelled a reduction of taxes and the exclusion of nobles from the government. In 5 years, from 1390 to 1394, Genoa had 10 revolutions, 10 doges rose and fell. Finally, order seemed more precious than freedom, and the harassed republic, fearing absorption by Milan, gave itself over with its Rivieras to France in 1396. 2 years later, the French were expelled in a passionate revolt. 5 bloody battles were fought in the streets, 20 palaces were burned, government buildings were sacked and demolished, property to the value of 1,000,000 florins was destroyed. Genoa again found the chaos of freedom unbearable and surrendered itself to Milan in 1421. The Milanese rule became intolerable, revolution restored the Republic in 1435, and the strife of factions was resumed. The one element of stability amid these fluctuations was the Bank of St. George. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.